The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Marilyn?
Yes.
Okay, floor is yours. You wanna start?
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Human Development and Leadership Division webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about employee motivation. It's a hot topic, and we're very pleased to bring to you Brooks Carter to talk about it today. Brooks is a leader in the safety performance industry and its application within quality. I've known Brooks for many years, I'm proud to say, and you're going to really be interested in his insights and stories, I can tell you that for sure. Brooks has been the assistant professor of psychology at UCLA. He's the author of over 40 scientific papers, and his famous book, Measurement Matters: How Effective Assessment Drives Business and Safety Performance, was published by ASQ Quality Press. Brooks graduated with an AB from Yale and a PhD in experimental psychology from University of Pennsylvania. He is our chair-elect here in the Human Development and Leadership Division. Brooks is going to have 2 sessions on this topic, and we're looking forward to both of them today and in 2 weeks from now. Just a few before I let Brooks take the podium, before we start this interesting topic, I'd like to just go over a few logistics. We are going to have everyone on mute just because it's very difficult to deal with all the technology otherwise. However, if you have a question, please do enter it in the question box. We'll probably save questions to the end unless there's something that's critical to the discussion. So with that, let me turn it over to Brooks. And thank you, Brooks, for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you, Marilyn. And thanks for coming. For most of you, it should be good afternoon or good evening. I'm going to talk about a topic that I've been interested in and thought about since I was in graduate school, which is a very long time ago. This may benefit you, and it may also give you problems because I may get into some levels of detail that you weren't expecting, because it is something I've worked in for a long time. I want to start out with a poll. And I think Marilyn knows how to run the poll. That's what the question looks like.
Okay, the poll is up. And if you can start clicking on the poll.
Does your compensation include incentive pay? Is the first question.
And right now we have about 50% of people voting. We're up to 65, 70. And we're kind of holding at 71%. Shall I close, Brooks?
Yes.
Okay. Closing and sharing. So here you go, Brooks. Can you see? 60% of the people have answered yes and 40% no.
Yeah, it didn't show up on my screen. But okay, 60% yes. The second poll question is for only for the people who answered yes.
Okay.
Does the incentive have a substantial effect on your performance?
Okay, I'm launching that poll now, and we're looking for a yes or no from the people who, 60% of the people who answered yes. And we are at 33% voting, 40%. Okay, I'm going to close that and share it. what we're seeing, Brooks, is 42% of the people are saying yes and 58% are saying no.
That's really interesting. And finally, this is for everyone. Do you believe that incentive pay is an important and necessary part of any compensation program?
Again, you can answer yes or no regardless of what you voted before, so everyone can vote. We're up to 50%. 60. And it looks like we're stabilizing at 63%. And you can see that 47% of the people answered yes, it's an important part, and 53% answered no. You get that, Brooks?
Yep.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
Okay.
I'm going to try to drive you to one end of this scale, but it'll take me 2 sessions to do it. Defining motivation, physiological and psychological processes that lead to action. Living organisms must take some kind of action to survive, and motivation is the ultimate force behind that action. In evolved species, like humans, presumably, motivation extends beyond physiological needs. In primitive species, it's all physiological needs. Human motivation involves nutrition, hydration, protection from the cold, reproduction, spiritual needs, cognitive needs, emotional needs. And here's a bunch of candidates for drives. The first few are, without any doubt, hunger, thirst, sex, warmth, rest, safety. Then we get into psychological needs, belonging, self-esteem, information, curiosity, mastery, religion. I recently read a paper on arguing that religion was a drive. I thought the argument was pretty good. Self-actualization. Money's not on here. Theoretically, money would come through its ability to satisfy some of the other needs, although some people eventually seem to develop money as independent of what it can buy and seek money. To qualify as a drive, you can't. One of the problems of amateur psychology is people see an action and they say there must be a drive for it. You can't just observe behavior and then a drive for it. If it's a human drive, it's got to be present in the vast majority of the population. And it must motivate behavior without requiring some kind of learning process. You can create needs by associating something with, I'm sorry, I didn't want to move to the next slide. You can, create a drive for money by associating money with the satisfaction of other drives. So money is not a primary drive. Also requires some kind of associative or learning process to be a drive. Thirst doesn't require that. Hunger doesn't require that. Sex doesn't require that. So to go back to this list of drives, I say these first 6 are very safe ground. Belonging self-esteem. These come from Maslow. Self-actualization is Maslow's highest level drive. Mastery, religion, and drive for information are things that my own observations suggest are drives. So let's proceed. Expression of drives. There are three ways that drives are expressed. One is that the drive is expressed with no modification through learning processes. It's called a fixed action pattern or stereotype behavior. You can see it in the mating behavior of dogs and cats. It's a fixed action pattern. It's stereotyped. It doesn't vary. You can have a drive that's slightly modified, or you can have a drive that's extensively modified. For example, take hunger. You can put some food on a plate and have somebody just attack it with no style or grace, and that's close to a fixed action pattern even in humans. Or you can call up your favorite restaurant and order a very elegant meal and have things that nobody ever thought of tasting. A lot of learning involved in that, have the right wine with it, and so on. And most human behavior is down in this category. There's virtually none up here in the fixed action pattern, and very little in the slightly modified. So there's a lot of cognitive processing that goes into the ultimate expression of behavior coming from drives. This is what I said before. In humans, the expression of most drives is highly modified by learning. The learning is constrained by heredity, and this is going to be very important. Learning and other psychological phenomena, higher psychological phenomena should be considered secondary modifications of innate mechanisms. This is contrary to most of what's taught in psychology today, and I will try to explain it. Motivation is the output of a system. You've got drives, you've got the environment, you've got deprivation condition, you've got the physical condition of the organism, and this vast area of learning, cognition. And we want to talk about employee motivation. We would like to have employees who are engaged, competent, innovative, driving for continuous improvement, and ideally focused on the needs of the company. Now, if you read business texts, this is a common theme, and I'm going to read it because you need to hear it. I can find endless examples of this, and this is one that I copied off the internet, off of business schools.
Excuse me, Brooke.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you please define heredity?
Yes, it's inborn. It's innate. It's a pattern that is passed on from your parents to you.
And why is learning dependent on that?
Because, well, let me go a little ways, and I'll show you.
Okay, great.
It's important because reinforcement theory assumes that's not the case. Reinforcement theory assumes infinite plasticity. this is from a business text. According to reinforcement theory, choosing one positive attribute to target at a time and applying positive reinforcement techniques. According to Skinner, extinction of the undesired behavior results from the absence of positive reinforcement. This means offering an incentive when work exceeds expectation, positive reinforcement, and withholding additional privileges when targets are not met. For example, you might offer a bonus for sales in excess of your weekly target, a long lunch for meeting the target, and a standard lunch with holding both the bonus and the long lunch for failing to meet it. Now, those of you who are, know the difference between special and common causes would say this program would fail based on the fact that he's going to be rewarding random fluctuations. But more than that, would you like to work for this guy? Would you like to get a long lunch when you meet your target?
Okay, I've just launched the poll. Please say yes or no. Would you like to work for this guy? We've got 31%, 45%. Brooks, we're getting a little, while they're voting, we're getting a little static from your microphone. Is there a way to keep it, you know, more still?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we're at 53%, 56. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share it. We've got 47% said yes, they would like to work for this guy, and 53% said no, they would not.
Interesting. I put up the poll because I thought somebody giving me a long lunch for meeting my target was just wasn't something I had in mind. But fair enough. Okay, most of us are familiar with the work of B.F. Skinner. That's a picture of Skinner when he was a young man. Most of us are not aware of his career, which I think is telling. After college, Skinner wanted to be a writer, but he couldn't think of anything to write about. So he went to college. Went to graduate school and got a PhD in psychology. And what he did in psychology was mostly write. His books became very well known, and he was very successful as a psychology writer. Unfortunately, he was very successful also in dominating a large portion of psychology for a long time. When he came to Harvard, he decided that the kind of research he did, which was he called operant conditioning, studying reinforcement theory, that he decided that was psychology. And the people who are studying personality and cognition and intelligence and things like that, they weren't doing psychology. And they were moved out of the psychology department at Harvard. And there was a second department called social relations, or SOCREL, that housed all those people who were doing the wrong thing. Well, operant conditioning and Skinnerian work, mostly with rats and pigeons, became the hallmark of psychology. And he argued that positive reinforcement was a universally effective way to control behavior. They argued that even the learning of language was done through positive reinforcement. And he believed that studies of schedules of reinforcement would yield useful laws of behavior. He published a book which was all the recording traces of animals pressing levers on different schedules of reinforcement, meaning they might have to press 10 times to get a reward, or they might have to press twice, or they might get rewards on random presses, no set number. This was a book that had virtually no text in it, and he thought this was a great book. This was kind of the apex of this unfortunate exercise. The idea is that all behavior is controlled by reinforcement. Reinforcers are things that satisfy a basic need. Money has reinforcing power because of its association with the satisfaction of needs. Behaviors that are followed by a reinforcer are strengthened, and reinforcement needs to occur within a second or so to be effective. Now, you say, I don't get paid till the end of the month, but you know when you qualify for it. So that would be what they call a secondary reinforcer. It's a signal that you're going to get reinforced. So that's how they explain human behavior when most reinforcers aren't happening within a second. Secondary reinforcers can bridge a time gap to payday. I once spent an evening with Skinner at UCLA. I was a young assistant professor. I was head of the learning and motivation area, and I was the only person who wanted to talk to him. He was a charming fellow. We had a great conversation. And quite ironically, we both agreed that neither of us was smart enough to understand the writings of Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky wasn't my greatest enemy, but he was Skinner's greatest enemy. He took off after Skinner very successfully. Skinner believed that theories were not useful. He wrote a very famous paper, Are Theories of Learning Necessary? And this is a quote, "Perhaps to do without theories altogether is a tour de force. That is too much to expect as a general practice. Theories are fun, but it's possible the most rapid progress toward an understanding of learning may be made by research that is not designed to test theories." Now, Deming's statement, which I heard him say probably 50 times, there's no knowledge without theory. Without a theory, you can't predict. And I think the disappearance of Skinner's work, which has largely disappeared on the academic side, is the fact that there is no theory there. Now, going back 20 years, though, 30 years, behaviorism was powerful. When I came into psychology, there was a large body of people who said measuring behavior is the only thing that's important. You can't, measuring cognition is a waste of time. It all comes down to behavior. Conditioning or learning can do anything. And this is a statement that the father of behaviorism was not really Skinner, it was John Watson, who was at Johns Hopkins University and later at J. Walter Thompson. He lost his position in academia due to having an affair with a graduate student and became a very influential man on Wall Street. He was a very smart guy. But he said this is a quote directly out of the Johns Hopkins magazine, alumni magazine. "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocation, and race of his ancestors." He was serious. That's what they believed. So if positive reinforcement is so effective and is so widely adopted in American business, why did the Gallup organization find in 2015 that 32% of American workers are engaged? Figure's gone down, by the way. By 2017, I think it's 28%. I mean, if we're using the right theory, how can this be? Well, you could say management has insufficient knowledge to apply behaviorist theory correctly. They're just doing it wrong. Or the theory is inadequate. I believe both are correct. I don't think management has the capability to use positive reinforcement properly, but it's mainly number two. Behaviorist theory is inadequate. Okay, I'm going to describe a study that is very arcane, and you'll have to work very hard to understand why it's so important, but it was a very important study. Kind of became the nail in the coffin of behaviorism. This is a man, John Garcia, who grew up as, was the son of farm workers, made it to the National Academy of Science. He was a friend of mine at UCLA, and we co-authored a paper, actually. And he provided very clear evidence of the importance of heredity in learning. He published a study in 1966, and this is famous enough. There are two Wikipedia articles on this study. It's the famous bright, noisy water study. John was working in a radiation lab studying radiation sickness because he couldn't get a very good job after he got his PhD. And he would put rats in a cage where he could shock them through the feet, or he could make them sick by putting ionizing radiation into them. And they had a spout to drink out of, and the water was flavored with saccharin, which they weren't used to. And when they drank, lights flashed and bells rung. So it was bright, noisy water. If he made them sick with radiation sickness, they would avoid the taste, but they would not avoid the bells and lights. And they could get sick as much as 12 hours after they tasted the saccharin, and they would still associate the saccharin with the illness and avoid it. If you shocked them through the feet, they would not avoid the water, the taste, but they would avoid the bells and lights. So here you have two kinds of learning in the same beast. This could tolerate delays of a few seconds at the most. This could tolerate, radiation sickness could tolerate delays up to 12 hours. Now, many of you may have had this experience where if you have a novel taste and you get sick, you won't like that taste, even if you know full well that cognition doesn't play a role. You can know that what you ate didn't cause the sickness, but you still won't like the taste. I had it happen. When John did this study, he couldn't get it published. People didn't understand why it was important. The leading psychology journals rejected it. When it was published, and it was published in a journal that didn't have didn't have peer reviews. You could publish, if you had a PhD, you could publish in that journal. So he published it there, and it took him about a year to be a full professor in an elite university after that, because the right people did read it. And that's an example of how heredity influences learning. And we're built that way, and rats are built that way, that we have a different learning process for taste and illness. The most important example of heredity-based learning is language. Chomsky, as he rears his head, demonstrated that the grammar of all human languages is the same. Now, this isn't the grammar that you decline a verb with. It's the grammar that enables you to understand any sentence, whether you've ever heard it or not before. It's the structure of sentences. Chomsky argued convincingly that behaviorist learning model could not account for the learning of language. One of the things that they did is slaves were often kept in groups where no two members of the group had the same native language. The idea was to prevent conspiracies. And so they developed a language, and the language they developed was Pidgin. It's known as Pidgin. And you've heard of Pidgin English, and that's what it was. And it's grammatically corrupt. Their children, who had never heard a grammatically proper language, developed languages called Creoles. And Creoles are grammatically complete. So children who've never heard a language spoken with proper grammar, because of the mixing of languages in Pidgin, develop a grammatically complete language on their own. And then this is one of Chomsky's examples. Take this sentence: the happy, happy candy likes the tall ice cream. What does that mean? Well, it's nonsense, but you know what it means. Isn't that a delightful slide? Another example: fear is a strong motivator, but if there's a well-learned response to prevent punishment, it will be elicited. If there is not, fear will impair creativity and probably motivate your employees to find a better job. Consider responses elicited by fear. Would punishment be a good way to cure impotence? Would incentives be more effective? In both cases, no. Another example of how genetics our heredity affects learning. So what is the point? There are many constraints on what you can learn and how you can learn it. But the claims of behaviorism are not true. Suffice it to say, and in the second session, I'll go into why I think in academia, behaviorism doesn't have a very important place. All psychology has moved to cognitive psychology, and that's what's being studied. Skinner would not admit that there was such a thing as cognition. But somehow this is persistent business. Okay, it's worse than you think, though. It's not just that incentives are ineffective, but they have a negative effect. These are some examples. Baseball and basketball players the year after they sign a large contract, show a decline in performance. Pretty consistent. Forced compliance studies. There was a lot of work in attitude change where to get somebody to change an attitude, you get them to advocate a position opposite the one they hold. If they're a Republican, you get them to make a speech on behalf of the Democrats or vice versa. And you're not telling them to change their belief, you're just but you're exposing them to the arguments. And it turns out the more you pay somebody to do that, the less their attitude changes. If you can get somebody to do it for free, they'll have a much bigger attitude change than if you pay them to make the speech. This is a far out example. Poetry students who spent 5 minutes just thinking about what they could get for writing their poetry wrote less creative work than students who did not spend that time. This represents hundreds of studies where incentives interfere with performance. Oops. This is a bad one. Measures of chief executive officer excess compensation are negatively related to firm performance. Guys who get the biggest bonuses do poorly. Daniel Pink, who's written a book called Drive, which is a good book on motivation, identifies these flaws. They can extinguish intrinsic motivation, which we have not talked about, but intrinsic motivation is motivation that does not depend on rewards. They can diminish performance. They can crush creativity. They can crowd out good behavior. They can encourage cheating, shortcuts, and unethical behavior. If you've read Freakonomics, there's a lot of that in Freakonomics, examples of cheating to get powerful incentives. The Chicago school system was going to fire teachers whose performance on standardized tests was not high enough, and they had huge amount of cheating. And who can blame the poor teachers? I mean, you can say they shouldn't have cheated, but they certainly shouldn't have been put in that situation either. They can become addictive, and then withdrawing the rewards is seen as punishment. And they foster short-term thinking. And this is unfortunately true of chief executives who get large bonuses for short-term results. It's the quarterly financial statement that is what matters. Deming was not a psychologist, but he was a brilliant psychologist. Long before psychologists would have said this, he said, it nourishes short-term performance, annihilates long-term planning, builds fear, demolishes teamwork, nourishes rivalry and politics. Now, he was so far ahead of his time, it's unbelievable. This is what Dan Pink became famous for in something like 2008 or 2010. Deming was saying this in the 50s. This is a study from Gallup. This is what employees want. In the past, they wanted a paycheck, job satisfaction, a good boss, an annual review, knowing what their weaknesses were in their job. Now people want a purpose Instead of satisfaction, they want to develop. Instead of a boss, they want to coach. Gallup is against the annual review and says there should just be an ongoing conversation with a subordinate. My strengths in my life, strengths instead of weaknesses, life instead of a job. And notice money at least is in here. It's not in here at all. It's a really good study that Gallup has done. Gallup has focused on employee engagement for a long time, and this is their latest study on it. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story now that shows that removing incentives can actually powerfully enhance performance. In 1991, I think, 92, I published an article in Quality Progress called Kicking the Habit of Bad Management. And it was kind of a funny article. It took a 12-step approach to transforming your management style. And I got a call from a guy and said, this is Mattress Mac in Houston. Like I was supposed to know who that was. And I need to kick the habit. So I'm going to come see you, which he did. Well, it turned out, if you live in Houston, you did know who Mattress Mac was. He was the most well-known figure in Houston, ahead of the mayor or any politician. He ran a furniture store that had the highest sales per square foot of any retail establishment in the United States. And he did it through TV ads. He can get on TV and tell people he'd save the money. The store was kind of bizarre at the time. It didn't look like a store. It was 3 mobile homes parked with kind of a tent between them and the furniture stashed everywhere. But Mac made a lot of money. It was a very successful store. He had a commission sales force, and he could close 49% of the people who drove into his parking lot. The way it worked was he had a tent full of salesmen standing in line, and when a car came in the lot, they would pick a salesman, and that was his car until the bitter end. And the top salesman got to go to the front of the line, which wasn't too fair. But he couldn't get the closing percentage over 49%. He said, I got to hire more high producers. And I told him that wouldn't work. That was probably the only advice I ever gave him that was of any help. And he worked on this for years, and he was relentless, but he didn't get anywhere. He called me one day and said, I want you to come down to Houston. I'm going to put the sales force on salary. And the reason he did it is he had heard Deming speak against commission for salespeople, basically because it encourages them to do things that are not in the interest of the customer. And so he did this in a very fair way. He took the top, for each person, he took their highest commission in 2 of the last 4 quarters and gave them that for a salary. So nobody took a hit money-wise. His high producers mostly quit. They didn't like it. But his result was that he had cooperative salesmen. His closing went to 60%, and the customer experience was much improved. In the old days, if you went there, you had some guy who wouldn't leave your side and basically chase you all the way to your car because you were his chance to get some money. And with the new system, people cooperated, and if one salesman didn't hit it off with a person, they'd put in another one. People got paid a lot less. His cost of sales was much lower. but people who wouldn't go to a store before started going because the customer experience was so improved. Now that says it's the end of part 1 and we're at 45 minutes, so that's pretty accurate timing.
That's pretty good, Brooks. We do have some questions here, and if you have additional questions, please go ahead and type them in. So the first question that we got had to do with heredity, and not saying that they don't believe heredity has anything to do with learning. My parents didn't study, no correlation. Would you like to comment on that, Brooks?
Could you say it again?
Sure. I don't believe heredity has anything to do with learning. My parents did not study. There's no correlation.
Oh, you don't, oh, okay. I think this is a person who thinks you inherit something that's been learned.
No, I think it's someone who thinks that you inherit either a love for learning or a knack for learning. I don't think that's what you were trying to say, was it?
No, what I'm trying to say is that there are associations that are harder to make and easier to make based on the way we're structured.
Can you say more about that?
Well, the Garcia example is the best. We're made to associate taste with illness, and we're made to associate pain with auditory and visual stimuli, not with taste. I mean, that's an extreme example, but it makes sense, but it doesn't fit the model.
Okay. One person is asking if you know the title of Skinner's book with no text and only pictures.
Yeah, it's called Cumulative Record.
Cumulative Record, okay.
I think he wrote it with Dick Hernstein.
And another question, are there any major companies, sorry, I have to scroll, which have discontinued financial incentives that you're aware of?
I am, but I can't remember. I can't remember the detail, but yes, there are.
Actually, I have a friend who just joined Amazon, who was told she would get the same salary as everyone else, and that would be her salary for as long as she worked at Amazon, and then there would be some incentives based on the kind of work that was done, but that's not exactly what that person is asking for, but I know it's something a little different. It's a different approach, and companies are experimenting.
Yeah, no, I came across a large company that had stop pay for performance, and I just can't remember which one it was. You're going to see this, though, because the data are so overwhelming.
Maybe you can bring that into the second seminar, Brooks.
Yeah, I'll try to find it.
Another question here, can you give us a preview of what you will cover in part 2?
I want to talk about intrinsic motivation. Motivation that's not dependent on incentives and is much more powerful. Yeah,
so right now you have debunked the usefulness of a behavioristic model for incentives, and now you're going to move on in the second section to say more about what does work.
Yes.
On the Amazon example, wasn't there another company that tried that and failed because there's no distinguishing factor in effort, is the question.
Well, that's always the argument. It's not fair to pay somebody who works hard the same as somebody who doesn't work hard.
Right.
There's an argument for incentives that, well, it's fair. It's not necessarily fair because Deming spent a lot of time demonstrating, and other people have done it subsequently, that you can't really, it's virtually impossible to measure the contribution of somebody. You know, the person who doesn't seem to work hard might be more important to the company than the person who looks like he works hard. I saw a presentation at Deming seminar by a woman who worked at Buick who spent like 3 years trying to craft a performance evaluation that worked and never could.
Yes, I think that that's an anti-intuitive concept, but it's been shown to be the case again and again. And that's one of the things about this work, right, Brooks, is that some of these concepts seem to make sense until you dig down and look at the research.
Well, in safety, there's a tremendous attraction to behavioral safety, which is, you know, it wasn't a behavior that caused the blowout in the Gulf in the BP rig. It was decision making. It wasn't behavior. But people seem to be fixated on behavior to the extent that they actually increase the probability of major accidents because they're spending all their time on minor stuff.
Mm-hmm. Working on special causes as though they're common instead of making fundamental changes to the system.
Yeah.
Another question, why do you think behavioralism is still so actively used in business today?
Well, that's one of the last things in my talk, but I think, one, it's simple. Two, it makes sense. Three, it's easier than alternatives. And
it's easier, that's for sure, than providing real intrinsic motivation.
And it's still taught.
Can you suggest some measurements that work for motivation? There's a comment here that says ultimately we talk about measurements. How do we measure in this instance? And because what we measure is what we can prove.
Well, I could go into a lot of philosophy on that, but I think ultimately you're looking at engagement, which Gallup has a scale for that. There are a bunch of actual scales developed by people who spend a lot of money doing it. But it's engagement.
Yeah, engagement. And I think one thing that Deming used to say also is that you must learn to manage that which you cannot measure, because so many things are difficult to measure and measure well.
I think Lloyd Nelson said the most important figures are unknown and unknowable.
Yeah, exactly. And here's another question for you, Brooks. Why do sports players and CEOs with large remuneration package not perform well?
Well, one of the things that happens when you're working with large incentives is the focus ends up being on the incentive, not the activity. And then when there's a huge incentive, you begin to develop fear of not getting it, and fear interferes with performance quite seriously. So that's a couple of reasons off the top.
Got you. Any other questions this afternoon for Brooks? Well, thank you guys for the lively discussion. Brooks, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I hope we can get people in in 2 weeks, because that's all on how you get employees engaged.
And that's the 7th of June for those of you who want to mark your calendars. Thank you. Interesting topic. Looking forward to part 2.
Cool.
Deepak, is there anything you want to say to close the session?
No, just thank you very much for attending today's webinar and looking forward for June 7th.
Will you be sending out a survey?
Yes.
So everybody look for the survey in your mailbox. If you registered, you will get one, and we're very curious to see your feedback on this webinar and any other suggestions you have for us for the future. Webinars is one of our most important member benefits, and we take it seriously to bring you the best. Okay, thank you, Brooks. Thank you, Deepak. And Deepak, I think we can stop the recording and